Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the 286 podcast. My name is Chris Akers, and on this podcast, we always talk about arts, culture, politics and sport, and anything else we can think of. Now, today's guest, I'm actually very delighted to speak to Niamh McAnally, who's written this wonderful book, Flares Up, which is actually from the same publisher which I used for my books. I'll be honest, as much as I'm not a sailing fan, but in a way, one of the best books are always those which draw you in. And this book certainly does. Niamh, would you like to introduce yourself and possibly read some passage from the book?
Sure. Thanks, Chris, for having me, and to all of your listeners. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. Yes, the book is called Flares Up, A Story Bigger Than the Atlantic. And maybe what I'll do is I'll just read you that first opening 2 or 3 pages and kind of give you an idea of what the book is about. And then we can chat maybe about how it all came about, how I got to that point of writing this book. Does that sound okay?
No, that sounds okay with me, absolutely. So please take it away.
All right, okay. So this is the opening of the book, and it starts with 20th of February, 2020.
Mm-hmm.
The flare set fire to the evening sky. From the same boat, a second one blazed. Its red sparks reflected on the dusky waters off the Antiguan coast. 2 flares, normally a sign of distress, a call for help, a plea for rescue. But not these flares, not this time, not this night. An hour earlier, locals and visitors, cruisers and superyacht staff had begun to gather around a podium at Nelson's dockyard in English Harbour on the southern end of Antigua. The atmosphere tingled. Word had gone out. They're coming. Outside the inlet, wind drove whitecaps onto nearby rocks and pelicans to further dives for fish. In the fading light, a dot appeared on the horizon. It disappeared, then reappeared again as it rode the swells. The closer it got, the more details emerged. A white boat, maybe 20 feet long, oars dipping in a lumpy sea. Stick figures became the silhouettes of 2 men slicing their way home. The media and race officials of Talisker Whiskey Atlantic Challenge jumped in powerboats and sped out to sea to guide them in. Only a couple more strokes, and these 2 middle-aged British men would complete their arduous voyage, having rowed 3,000 nautical miles across the Atlantic, from the Canary Islands to the Caribbean. As the tiny vessel skimmed between the red and green buoys marking the finish line, the cannon fired and the harbour erupted in a cacophony of horns, hooters, ships' bells and whistles. From every sailboat to luxury yachts, every deck of every moored boat was laden with mariners applauding their achievement. And along the cliff road, citizens and expats waved their national flags. In keeping with race tradition, the 2 balding, bearded men stood up in their tiny boat, despite the choppy sea, lit their handheld flares and raised them to the skies. The red-hot blaze illuminated their weary but elated faces. Smoke snaked its way around their torsos and morphed into clouds of gray against the dark green hills. The media boats circled them, filming their moment of triumph. Race officials in an inflatable dinghy followed their arc. Round and around the rowers they sped, churning up a congratulatory spray. In the center of the rowboat, still as bronze, stood the 2 men who had dared to dream. On the quay, emotion overwhelmed the well-wishers who waited for them to step ashore. "I'm in bits," one tourist said, "and I don't even know them." "Me neither," said a local woman, passing her a tissue. "I came down because I heard they had no family here to greet them." Beside them, a proud father who'd flown from South Africa chatted with his 25-year-old son who'd crossed the finish line the previous week. 4 small children with Scottish accents stood next to their mum, anxiously awaiting their dad, who still had 6 more days to row. This crowd of international strangers had become friends, united in the recognition of the potential of the human spirit. "Ladies and gentlemen, the Danish race director Karsten Olsen announced, "Let's give it up for Team Atlantic Dream Challenge." Cheers echoed off the harbor walls as the vessel touched the dock. Onlookers found it hard to grasp that this boat, adorned with inspirational stickers, signatures of supporters, and rust stains that dripped from a now defunct solar panel, this small wooden boat, whose only form of propulsion came from the carbon fiber oars and the sheer determination of the men who plied them, had just traversed a tumultuous sea. In homes across the world, devoted followers watched the live stream on the internet as these two stocky, unathletic-looking men posed for photos. Between them, they held a banner that read, "We rode the Atlantic." "Would you like to see them step ashore?" Karsten asked the crowd. Another cheer. One after the other, the men set foot on solid ground and swayed. Marine lagged. Their bodies were still tuned to the rhythms of their watery home. They weren't the first to arrive, nor were they the last, but when they took their place on the podium, next to the sign documenting their certified time, they hugged, slapped each other on the back, and bellowed a winner's roar. They'd done it. They had damn well done it. Questions peppered the minds of those who stood in awe. Who were these intrepid characters? Paul Hopkins and Phil Pugh from Newcastle upon Tyne. And why? Why did they decide to row across an ocean? Not the prepared why they told the press, or the noble why they told their friends, but the real why they told themselves in the dark of night. The why that drove them during the years of preparation and enabled them to say goodbye to loved ones they prayed they would see again. The why that made quitting not an option when they faced storms and equipment failure in the middle of Poseidon's rage. And the why they had yet to discover once they had stepped on dry land and reflected on who they had become during those 70 days, 9 hours, and 11 minutes at sea.
Such a powerful intro. And like I said, when I read the book, I thought I thought it was incredible. Such an incredible read, and it's one of those books where it's like I said, it transcends. There's certain sports books I've read, which even though I don't like the sport, I still like my top 10 sports books because the story transcends actual sport itself. But how on earth did you hear about these two men, and what made you decide to write their story?
Very good question. Well, I've been living on a sailboat for 6 years with my husband, Gary, and I'll tell you a little bit how I got even to that point. But we were in Antigua at the time that this Talisker Whiskey Atlantic Challenge was taking place in terms of the boats coming in. And about 2 days earlier, I had noticed in this beautiful historic venue, Nelson's Dockyard, it goes back to Admiral Nelson back in the day. And there was this wooden boat, and somebody had said, well, somebody rowed that like years and years ago. They rowed it across the Atlantic. And we'd been living on a 40-foot sailboat for like almost 6 years at that point. And I was thinking, no, that doesn't compute in my brain. You know, I've lived in a 40-foot sailboat. That is small. I've been out there in that Atlantic in like some horrible conditions. I just couldn't get my head around it, but that was that. And then we were sitting in the cockpit having a late lunch. And part of my story is kind of reflected in that opening was we heard somebody say, they're coming. And I went like, who's coming? And they said, two of the lads are actually coming in on the challenge. They're about to row ashore. And I went, you're kidding me. We're actually going to see somebody doing this. So in Nelson's Dockyard, where the finish line is, there's obviously the red and green markers out as the entrance to the harbor. And there's kind of a dog leg in that harbor, and there's all these big super yachts there. So the view from the podium is kind of obscured, or sorry, the view from the finish line is a little bit obscured. And I said to Gary, we live on a boat. We've got a dinghy. Let's jump in our dinghy and go out to the harbor, right, to see them coming in. I thought it was a great idea. I grabbed my dry bag and my camera, and we got in the dinghy and we went out, and it was very rough actually. We were bobbing around, and he says, do you see anything? Do you see anything? I said, no, nothing at all. And then I went, wait a minute. And I had the camera with the zoom lens, and I went, I could see through that. And I said, I think I see a dot. I think I see a dot. I was just getting like, I was like a kid, you know what I mean? Just so excited. And then eventually started to see, I said, oh my God, it is them, it is them, it is them. And they crossed in front of us through that finish line. And what happens next is it's their Olympic podium moment after these 3,000 miles across the Atlantic. The handheld flares that they have on board for, you know, emergencies, they stand up and they light them. And what happens is the media boat circles them in a big spray, if you like, and they're filming it like almost one of those chariots of fire moments, do you know, what have movies. And we were just outside of the spray. And so the bottom of the cover of the book, you can see that wake of the boats going. And I was clicking away at the camera with kind of almost like a sports photographer. I'm not, but do you know what I mean? I was like this. And all of a sudden, one of the media boats went to the left, the other inflatable went to the right. And I just had that shot. And I the second I took the photograph, I knew, you know, and I turned around to Gary, I said, we've got the shot. I just know it. Right? And I was so emotionally connected to it. You know, I didn't know these people from a hole in the ground, but it was like, there was something about it. I turned around to Gary and I said, this moment will live with me for the rest of my life. It was so magical. And I said, okay, well, let's hurry up. Let's get back ashore so we can see them getting off the boat and see what it's all about. And I said, but however, don't speed off too much because I don't want to, you know, upset their boat with a big wake from our dinghy. And he goes to me, he says, Niamh, these guys have been in the ocean in 30-foot or 40-foot, whatever it is, waves. Our dinghy is a 15 horsepower engine that spits out this much, and we're not going to upset the rowboat at all, right? And I went, oh, okay. So we zoom ashore, we tie up the dinghy, we jump down towards the podium. They touch the dock, and just like the part I read there, we were all standing there watching them, like, couldn't believe it. They got off the boat. They were like, it was always like they were drunk because they were so used to being on a boat. And they got up on the podium, still took photographs. And I think at one point, one of them actually made eye contact with me, and I just nodded and was like, yay. But once the crowd disappeared, they sat down outside the restaurant area of Nelson's Dockyard, and they were sitting by themselves. And I thought, that's very odd. So myself and Gary went over and we said hello, we chatted and everything else. And then I said, well, why don't you come on to our boat for your first home cooked meal tomorrow night? And they went, yeah, that's great. So they came, one of the guys, Paul, at the time, apparently called his wife that night. And he goes, yeah, A, we're here. And B, we've just been invited onto one of the super yachts. And I went, no, it's a 40-foot sailboat, right? And he goes, listen, we've been on a 20-foot rowboat. It's a super yacht to us, okay? So they came on board, and both Paul and Phil and myself and Gary, we like had a nice dinner with them, and we started talking, and they learned I was a writer. And we started talking about the idea of the story, which was fascinating to me. And like you said there in your introduction, this story is way bigger than how to row an ocean. And I said to him, look, who do you want to know your story? Because if it's just how to row an ocean for people who are mechanically wanting to learn how to do it, that's great, but it's a very small group of people and not many people will be interested in that. I think your story is bigger than that. And I said, but here's the thing, if you can dig deep emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, and tell me why you did it, what drove you, you know, and also how did it affect your families, your wives, your children? Were they on board? How long did it take you to get to the starting line? It's a family story. It's a human interest story. I said, that's worth doing. And I said, that's the story we're telling. And I think to your comment there, it's kind of started out its life in a sports kind of genre, but it really is being picked up by men, women, children. I've actually had a teacher yesterday pick the book up saying, I want my kids to read this in whatever grade it is here in America, like they're 14, 15 years of age. It's that story that is set yourself a goal, try and achieve it. What do you learn about yourself along the way? If you don't, if you do, how does it impact other people? And I think that's what's appealing. And I think that's why it's a bit of a page turner.
Okay. So obviously very quickly, not long after you first met them, you told about you wanted to write their book. One, what was their initial response? Because I imagine the way you want to write it, yes, it's easy to write about the boat section beyond the seas, but before that and after that, when you've all as a family, that must take a lot of trust in you for them for them to give you permission to do that. So how was that trust built? What did they say when you proposed that to them?
You're absolutely right. That was one of the things I said, look, you've got to dig deep emotionally. And do I have your permission to do so? You know, are you going to work with me on that? And they did. And I interviewed their families. I interviewed their wives. I interviewed one set of the children. So I interviewed a lot all around the families. And so everybody was on board with the project. Do you know what I mean? Because you couldn't do something like this. And I was very conscious of the fact that I would be retelling stories of a real person still alive, which was a huge responsibility, as you can imagine, to respect the truth of it, but also respect their, to a certain extent, their privacy, although they've given me the life rights to their story, obviously, in order to tell it. And I think we built up the trust over a period of weeks as we went through the story. We started off with just the storyline itself, the actual mechanics of it. What happened, this happened, then happened, that happened, and then this is how we did the next part. But it was later on we said, okay, well, how did you feel about that? You know, and stuff evolved, which was very interesting for them too. They started to answer questions that they didn't know they had questions. Do you know what I mean? The answers started to bubble up with them. And one of them was one of their whys. And Paul in particular had said to me, I didn't realize that was one of my reasons for doing this. So in a way, they found the experience very cathartic, you know, and it kind of made sense to them as to putting it all together. And the other part of it was they had fully planned to do some speaking engagements when they got back to the UK, and they were ready to tell their story. But as they said to me recently, their story would have died because they arrived back in February of 2020, just as the world was shutting down. And there was no, you know, public engagements or, you know, meeting and greeting people. And so it was during the pandemic that I wrote the book with loads of Zoom calls with them and phone calls and emails back and forth. So yeah, it was a good trust, but I think we really cemented the trust, believe it or not, in Antigua itself. That night we had a long, deep conversation. They kind of understood who I was and what I was about. But the next morning I said, okay, that's all lovely. We're all having dinner. Tomorrow morning we'll meet for coffee and we'll decide, is this really what you want? You'll have time to slept on it. And before you go back to England and be with your families, you really need to think about, do you want to do this? Because it's a time consuming, as you know yourself, Chris, from writing books, it's a very time consuming project. Not just the research, but the actual physical, you know, writing and then the editing and the rewriting. So I said, I'm not going into this until we're all on board, right? And I gave them a couple of things. I wrote a few articles about it and just kind of gave them a flair for my writing style and how I would treat their story. And from that, more and more trust grew, I think.
Okay. So obviously their story captured you, but initially it was the sailing that hooked you in, and then their story, their own human story behind it. So that's what I kind of wanted to ask you is, how did you get into sailing? Because I've done canoeing before, and I've enjoyed it a little bit, but I've been on bigger boats and I've been seasick. So why is it about sailing that you've loved? And actually, how did you get into the activity?
That's interesting. I grew up in Dublin by the sea, and like I could look out my bedroom window and see the sea, and I would see a lot of little small dinghy kind of sailboats, you know, the very small, I think they're called mirrors or lasers. Are you picking up that? I don't know what that is. It sounds like you can't hear. Yeah. So there's I grew up in Dublin, and I was watching the boats out on the water, and we didn't really have the resources to join the sailing club at the time. I think we went out about once or twice, and I'd learned a little bit, you know, if the boat capsizes, this is how you get back on it, etc. But years passed, I became a scuba instructor. And so I was working on boats down in the Florida Keys when I moved over here originally into the States. And then I was big into canoeing, and I think I got into a rowboat once up in Canada, but that wasn't my thing. Anyway, so years had passed, and I was working in Sark in the Channel Islands. At the time, I was managing a hotel there on the island. And the hotel at one year just decided to close for the particular year. They weren't going to open. And the previous year we had gone from year round to seasonal, and I had a bunch of staff I had to lay off for the winter. And I was thinking, well, how can we get them to come back, now that they're trained, come back at Easter for the summer season? And I found this website called workaway.info, where you volunteer 5 hours a day, 5 days a week in exchange for food and lodging. And I thought, well, that's a great idea. You could go anywhere in the world, just get the plane ticket to get there, and you'd have somewhere to live, you'd have food on your table, and you could be helping somebody else, and then come back to me at Easter. So that happened that year. And I was thinking, that was great. I wanted to put my hand up. It's like, I'd like to go do that myself. And, but I was like full-time, so I had to stay put. The following year, when the hotel closed for the whole year, I said, that's it. I'm going to take a year out. I'm going to travel around the world as a volunteer. And my idea was to circumnavigate, although not by boat, by plane. So I started out in London, went to St. Bart's and helped a family do a dive business there, down to New Zealand, another hospitality business. And then I ended up in Tonga, in the Kingdom of Tonga, with a family who ran a swim with the whale business from a catamaran. And I thought that would be perfect for me. And I was the tutoring of the teenagers was just help them get their assignments in on time, because they were in distant learning from Australia. And I had a couple of days where we sailed from Tonga up to American Samoa, which is about 3 days of a sail up to American Samoa, across the Tongan Trench, actually. And I didn't know an awful lot, to be perfectly honest. And the captain was so sweet. He was like, well, I didn't even know it was called a line instead of a rope. He says, pull that one and let that one go. And I just did what I was told, right? And then I started to do night watches, and there's 2 lines and what I now know is a chart plotter, and the boat is here, keep it in between the 2 lines. And if you see a light on the horizon, if you see a light, tell me, wake me up right away. Don't tell me when it's a mile away, tell me when it's 5 miles away. And I'm like, it's pitch dark. How do I know if a light is like 1 mile away or 5 miles away? And I learned pretty quickly. But so that was my experience. And at the end of that whole year, I went up through Palau, did some more with scuba diving, and back through Asia, and ended up back in London. So that was my year. I had done it all. And I'd started to send out resumes again. And then I was almost addicted to this website. It was like virtual travel. Like you could go sheep shearing in Croatia. Do you know what I mean? There's all these different things you could do. I then found this one, which was to volunteer crew a sailboat from Florida to the Bahamas for 1 month. And I thought, that's perfect. I'll do that for a month. And I promise I'm going to settle down again after that. Right. So I arrived, I came to Florida, and I met the captain, and we had a couple of hiccups, but we eventually got sailing and across to the Bahamas. And I was starting to really enjoy it. And he was teaching me a lot about the sailing. And we worked our way. I was due to go back to Ireland in that summer. And the longer I stayed on the boat, the less chance there was for me to actually get up and start something new. So I said, I should stay on. Stayed on for what turned out to be 4 months. Now, here's what happens. When you live in a 40-foot sailboat, 24/7 with one other person, you get to know that human being the inside out. Do you know what I mean? And it's because you're relying on each other for each other's safety. You're trusting each other. You rarely, if ever, have internet, Wi-Fi, cell service. You're not going to the movies. You're cooking your meals from scratch. You're washing the dishes by hand. When you want to do your laundry, you're throwing it into a backpack, putting it on the dinghy, going ashore, finding a laundromat if you can find one wherever you are. Watch it go around for 2 hours like you're a student and you can't go anywhere else. Back in. So like somebody says to you, what are you doing on the boat today? Oh, well, we're doing laundry. Yeah, but what else are you doing? Actually, we're doing laundry. That's today's event, So anyway, we suddenly realized there was some kind of deep connection between us. And I know at the time he was very much, I used to say, allergic to pecans and relationships. And he was like, this is fun, but, and I was like, yeah, I know it's amazing. But when we get the boat back, like we'll say goodbye to each other. And we did. We brought the boat back and we said goodbye to each other. And he went up back to his family out in California. And I actually stayed on the boat while I was waiting to go to Ireland. And 3 weeks later, he calls up and he goes, what are you doing now? And I went, well, I'm actually still working on your boat. I'm scrubbing the stainless steel, as a matter of fact, right? And he said, well, what are you doing next? And I went, probably scrubbing the bit over here. And he said, no, I'm thinking of coming back and taking the boat out again. And I went, okay. And he said, do you want to come with me? And I went, sure, I got another month left, right? So I said, where are you going? And he goes, up the east coast of America, up to New Jersey. And I said, well, what's up in New Jersey? We just come from the Bahamas. And he goes, Newark, and a very cheap flight to Dublin. And I went, oh, so you are going to come visit my family in Dublin? I had asked him before, when I didn't realize he was like, you meet the family. Like, what does that say about where we're at, right? And I didn't realize, because I was thinking, oh, yeah, it's Ireland, you'll love it, right? So anyway, so we sailed up. The most incredible experience was going, actually, after we got back, believe it or not, I'm jumping ahead. But we went to Ireland. He met my family, and here was the problem. They loved him. He was probably the first person they really loved out of everybody I'd been dated in my life. But anyway, so that was like, oh, kind of stuck with you now. We came back and we sailed up through New York Harbor past the Statue of Liberty. And that was extraordinary for somebody who has come to live in America, you know, literally on your sailboat, like, oh, wow. Anyway, went all the way up to Maine, came back down again, and we were on the boat a year at that point. And the thing in boating is when you're traveling on the boat, you meet other boats. People won't remember your name, but they'll remember the name of your boat. So you have little boat cards, like business cards.
Yeah.
Usually a picture of the boat on the front with the picture of who the captain is, and on the back it's your details. And so Gary had the picture of himself on the boat and everything on the front and his details on the back. And as more people were getting to know me at these different ports, they kept asking, well, who's she, right? So he was starting to write my name on the back of the card, etc. Anyway, after a year, we called it our boat anniversary, which was the 15th of January back in 2017. He said, I have a card for you. I think it was like, happy boat anniversary. No, it was one of those little cards. And now it's a picture of the two of us on the front. And I was like, aha, so we're getting over our allergy then. And how relationships are we? So, and from that day forward, we just kind of went, yeah, this is what we have going now together is bigger than the sum of ourselves. It was just stepping into the right relationship, the right everything. And we just started sailing. I was back into writing. So I would write, and we'd sail, and we would visit all these ports. We spent about 3 different seasons in the Bahamas. And then we took the big leap and we went down to the Caribbean, started out in the Virgin, like Puerto Rico, and all the way out through the Virgin Islands, out to down Martinique way, all the way down to Grenada, did a summer or so in Grenada, back up the chain, back down to Grenada. And then we did a little session in Bonaire. And we were in Antigua, as I said, when this all happened. And we were heading to Bonaire for the summer because it's slightly south of the hurricane belt, because you want to get your boat outside, as far out of the hurricane zone as you can during the summer months. And we were heading to Bonaire, and we were going to go scuba diving for the summer. He'd learned how to scuba dive since. And then suddenly things started to shut down. And the ports, it was like, I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it. We were on a list to get to Bonaire. We had heard of a family who had left, I want to say, the Spanish Virgin Islands on the route to Curacao, which is a 4-day open water passage across the Caribbean Sea. Mm. And by the time they got there, that country had closed due to the pandemic as well. Yes. And they were told, no, you can't come in. And we were like, oh, what are we going to do now when that's starting to happen? And we were with another boat in Antigua, and they were thinking we could stay in our boats, we'd be safe during the pandemic, you know, because we're not going to be, we'd be isolating naturally, we've been isolating all along, but where are we going to get supplies from? And can we afford to live on the boat on Anchorage? And we'd heard that people were going to have to stay on the boat for the 14 days, which was normal for everybody at that stage. We were isolating for 14 days. We got on a list to get back into Grenada, and they said, but you must be underway. And we said, well, we're coming. Again, that was another 3 or 4 day passage to get there. And by the time we were going to get there, Grenada had closed. And I was on a list, which was fine. But then we heard, not only were you not going to be allowed ashore for those 14 days, you had to stay on your boat permanently. And you were allowed eventually, I think it was about 1 hour a week or 2 hours a week to go in to get some groceries and stuff like that. Which sounded awfully restrictive. And then the other thing was there was very few ICU beds in the smaller Caribbean nations. And so what if we got sick? Obviously, they would want to take care of their own citizens first, which would rightly so. And if the virus had taken hold of, a small country like that, you could wipe it out quite quickly, small nation countries. So we made the big decision, okay, let's see if we can get the boat hauled out here in Antigua, leave it here. And as much as we didn't want to, we got on a plane to fly back to the United States. Because here's how I really knew it was serious at the time. The US State Department said, if you're overseas and you're a US citizen, get back now or remain overseas indefinitely. We don't know how long. Number two, they canceled St. Patrick's Day in Ireland. Now, in the history of my life, I'd never seen that happen. And the third thing was they closed the pubs in Ireland. I mean, that's Armageddon right there. Yeah. Right. So I thought this is really, really serious. We got to do something. And we had one of those interesting situations whereby I had one of these expat medical insurances that covered me everywhere except America at the time. And Gary had medical insurance that covered him in America. So we were kind of like, but where do we go? And a friend of ours had been on a boat. They were English, and she had flown back the month earlier to help her mother, who was going into a nursing home. And he had remained on the boat waiting for her to come back. And she never got back. And he ended up on that boat by himself for the best part of 8 months and had to solo sail it across the Atlantic back by himself. And I was like, okay, here's rule number one. Gary, you and I are not separating. No matter what we do, we're going together. Yeah. Just because we'll figure it out. And our friends from Canada said, we've got a solution. We have a little house next to our house, and it's up on a lake outside of Toronto, and it's totally isolated. We have our house. You can live in our little cottage next door. It would be great. If Niamh gets sick, she'll be covered here in Canada. If Gary gets sick, we'll drive him to the border and kick him across. And poor Gary had this idea that his van would drive up, the sliding door would open, and he would duck and roll across the United States border. So that was insane. So but that was our plan. We were on plan C at that time. And the next thing was the next day, as you know, things happened really fast over a period of 7 days. Next thing, the US-Canadian border closed. So we couldn't go to Canada, and they couldn't go to their, they had a winter home down in Florida. So we said, okay, you go to Canada, and they invited us to rent their house down in Florida, which is what we did. Mm-hmm. And so we ended up in Florida at that point and hunkered down, and we got through the plane ride. We did our 14 days, in isolation, like any type of cough, sniffle or whatever. We were like, are you okay? Are you okay? Mm-hmm. And we got through, and we were very, very blessed.
Gosh. I mean, not just in terms of the story themselves of the two men, but I mean, you could write a book about that journey in itself. Just incredible.
Well, it's actually funny. I have written a memoir that actually at this point is the prequel to Flares Up, because it tells that story of when I went around the world as a volunteer, and then finding Gary and finding that and being on that boat. It takes us all the way up to us trying to get married, believe it or not, because I had to update it after this one got published first. So I brought it up right through COVID. Yeah. The part I missed out actually was I want to say it was 2019 in Thanksgiving, which is, as you know, a big North American holiday in November. And we were on the sailboat in a little island called Beckway, which is part of the St. Vincent and Grenadine chain. And we were on deck, and he'd organized this kind of dinner ashore, and it was supposed to be a nice romantic dinner, whatever. And he said, I was going to wait till later, but it makes sense. We're on the deck. We're right here. The sun is going down. He had champagne, and he proposed right there on the deck. It was like, woo! It was quite extraordinary. Yeah. And then we went ashore. We went for this dinner, and then the couple of people who were working in the restaurant came over with these flowers. Oh, your husband-to-be would love you to have these. And then suddenly, and your husband-to-be would love you to hear this music, right? So they came up with this like kind of boombox behind with their music, right? And I'm trying to look at him thinking, oh, I should be listening to the lyrics. He's obviously, gone to a lot of lengths to choose these right 3 songs. And I said, remind me to ask him afterwards, but I was just smiling so much. And later on that night we got home, and we got back on the boat, and I said, the music, I'm so sorry. I know it was very important to you. He goes, I never heard that music in my life before. They just picked that randomly. It was just so funny. And we kept the little bouquet of flowers, and I had it on the boat. And I was like, I'm fascinated how long these flowers lasted, because stuff perishes quite quickly. These flowers were lasting for ages, and then one or two of them would die, and I would throw them away. But the rest of them were doing good. What I didn't realize was the bouquet was made of half fake and half real flowers that they had picked that day. They were just amazing. It was just so much fun. But anyway, so yeah, the memoir covers all that story as well up to that point of COVID. And getting ashore, and we tried to get married, and then of course COVID canceled the weddings on us. But what we ended up doing was in the when we were in Antigua, it was actually that January, we did what they call toes in the sand. So we had a minister, if you like, and ourselves and two of our sailing buddies, two sets of couples. So there was the 6 of us on the beach in Antigua, and we had the legal ceremony there, because we thought it would be easier there than trying to get everything done in Ireland. And then the Irish wedding got cancelled. It got cancelled, and we postponed it a year. Like, so many people got caught out like that. And the second one was getting cancelled because the quarantine issues were still in place for people traveling into Ireland from the States. So at the end of that, whatever that was, 21, towards the end of 21, I just said, it's fine, don't worry about it. We're a year and a half into this at this point, and I had this beautiful wedding dress hanging up in the house here in Florida. And I said, at this stage it's mocking me, you know what I mean? And it's been looking at me like, are you going to wear me, or are you going to eat that biscuit? I was like, I'm kind of done. And in the end, what we decided to do was we split the wedding in half. So we were able to go into Ireland and quarantine for the 2 weeks, because we were time off, but Gary's children and grandchildren couldn't, because they were at school or they were working. So we went off and we had a wedding just for my immediate family in Ireland. And then we came back, we flew literally back to back weekends, wrapped up the dress, wrapped up the suit, got back on a plane and went back to the States and had a wedding for him. So technically we were married 3 times now.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
So you're married in Antigua, Ireland, and then America.
In the US, yeah.
Oh gosh, okay. I mean, the way you talk and the way you describe things, I can tell that you obviously enjoy the writing as well. So where did that start for you in terms of writing? Because is this your first book, or have you written stuff previously?
Yeah, it's the first one that's been published out there in the UK by a traditional publisher. I started writing like in school kind of days. I remember the first 5,000 piece I wrote was a thing called "Do You Ever Wake Up in the Morning?" And it was kind of autobiographical, a teenager, 16-year-old, like, woe is me, here's my life, and you know what I mean? So I've always been writing, and yet I've had a lot of different careers throughout my life. This is if you call my writing career, my 5th career technically. But the writing has always been there as the background. And when I would travel or go anywhere on vacation, when I would start off saying an email, oh, I'm doing great. But then I would say, that sounds really boring. And I would actually kind of write a descriptive email, if you like. And I've been a big traveler my whole life. And one of my nephews is the best tribute I ever had. He said to me, I learned geography through your travels. You know what I mean? You go to places I've never even heard of. Got to look them up on a map. They'd never heard of Vanuatu, for instance. And I went down there to do a turtle reef conservation program, turtle conservation program, and things like that. So I've always written like that. But then I didn't really get serious, like into full-time writing, until I got on the boat, believe it or not. So, I believe a lot of things in the universe conspire in your favor. And suddenly now I had the time, I had the resources, I had a laptop, I had the ocean, I had times of distraction. I didn't have an office, I didn't have cell service, and we didn't have a lot of space on the boat. But the one thing Gary used to do every morning was he would make the bed. And it was a queen bed at the top, and probably a twin down to a single at the feet, because it was in the bow of the boat. But it was the only kind of major space that you could. And so he would make the bed, and that became my office. I would sit up there with my laptop and I would type away. Or I'd be up in the cockpit when he'd be on the helm, and it was a calm day. There was one day we were coming from Guadeloupe up to Antigua, actually, right before all this happened. And the way the chain of islands happens in the Caribbean, there's a lot of the Atlantic Ocean squeezing through the two islands and out into the Caribbean Sea. So as you can imagine, that's a huge body of water going through a very narrow space, which makes current and tidal flow very strong. So on each end of each island, you kind of get what they call a compression zone, where it's all coming together. The wind is wrapping around, the waves are wrapping around, the current is wrapping around. And if you're coming along down the chain of islands, you'd suddenly go very bumpy for that period of like 2 miles offshore this one and 2 miles before the next one. But between Guadeloupe and Antigua, there's a big expanse of water, which is fine, but there's some kind of upwelling in the middle, and you're going along, and in the middle of that body of water, it can get very bumpy. It's almost like standing waves. And one day I'm in the cockpit, it's about time for lunch, so I'm about to go down below into the galley to make some lunch, and I have my laptop in my hand, and and when you get on a boat and you go to stand up, sometimes that's okay, but sometimes the boat and the sea will tell you, no, now's a good time for you to sit down.
Yeah.
So I went like this, and I sat back down. And as I sat back down, this humongous alarm that we'd never heard before went off. And I went like, whoa, what is that? It was so loud. I thought, the fire brigade was coming. Couldn't figure out what it was. As a result, I got such a fright. I went like up in the air with my hands. The laptop flew up in the air, smashed down on the cockpit. And I was like, well, there goes that book. And it turned out I had sat down on the air horn, which is what you use to warn other vessels in the fog. And it made such a loud noise. So my laptop was broken. And it would only type the letter M or something else like that. And it took forever to try and get another one. So that was a bit of a hiccup in the writing process, because I'm not good with pen and paper. And then trying to get another one coming in, it was tough. But anyway, that's where I did most of my writing.
Gosh, oh man. Yeah, I mean, just the environment you're writing in, just trying to write on a boat and the waves and whatnot. I mean, as I said earlier in the introduction, it would make me seasick. So fair play to you for trying to do that. I mean, that's incredible. But going back to something you said about the intimacy of when you're on a boat with someone, and it's clear from reading this book, that's what you try to capture between these two men. What they went through is incredible, because up until they had a mutual friend who introduced them, but really they only met each other almost like a few weeks before they were due to go. When you first met them, did it feel like they only just met each other? Did it feel like a friendship that had lasted for years? Because I imagine being on that boat, like I said, that's your only really companion to have. And that's your only real like stimulation you've writing in terms of talking and so on and so forth. But did their friendship feel like it was something that lasted years? Because I imagine it would have done.
Yes. And I think looking at them together, you can tell instantly that no matter what was going to happen from this day forward, there would be a bond between them that would be unlike any other bond you would have with another human being, because only the two of them were in that boat for that length of time, and only the two of them had to navigate everything that came their way. A lot of it obviously was on land before they got to the starting line. The interesting thing that I found about the dynamic between the two of them is that they're both alpha males. They're both very much well used to doing their own thing and being in charge of their events, right? Paul, who was the instigating party of this whole experience, is, or was at the time, a firefighter. And he had survived a brain hemorrhage. And as a result of that brain hemorrhage, he decided, okay, I got to do something. I got to do something incredible with my life. And one of the things that drove him, which we later learned, was that as a child, he was dyslexic. And he felt all along that he was being bullied for being stupid, for being thick, for not being taken, seriously. And he had difficulty, with writing down and stuff like that. And so for him to have got through all of his exams to become a firefighter was extraordinary. And he was an amazing firefighter. He rose right through the ranks and of his firefighter career. So he was the guy driving this. And if I just fill a little bit of backstory, what happened was he was on one of these sea safety courses for the fire brigade, because they also use the boats on the River Tyne, where unfortunately people jump off bridges and all sorts of rescues happen on the river as well. So he was on one of these sea safety courses, and he met this guy who wasn't working for the Navy, wasn't one of the cruise ship people, and he was saying, well, do you work for any of the nautical people? And he goes, no, I'm just here because I'm going to row across the North Sea. And Paul apparently looked at him and went, there's a ferry, you know that, right? It comes with a bed and an overnight and a dinner. And he goes, yeah, no, ocean rowing is a sport. And he had never heard of it. And he started to think about it, and then he sort of said, maybe that's something I could do. And then he got into his computer and he started Googling. And Paul, being Paul, which people will learn about him in the book, the determination of this man and the drive behind him, what he was trying to prove that he was worthwhile as a human being, was he decided, okay, I got to go big. And so he typed in the world's toughest row. And that's what came up, the Talisker Whiskey Atlantic Challenge, the 3,000 miles. And he goes, right, I'm going to do that. And then he went, okay, well, a couple of things I need to do first, though. First of all, I got to kind of learn how to row. And number two, get a boat. And three, a team. And maybe ask my wife. So kind of in that order, which is something that we explore in the book as the dynamic of how that went down in his family. Spool forward to the fact that he was trying to find a team. He had a lot of hiccups getting a team together. And he really, at one point, thought it wasn't going to happen. And finally, as you mentioned, a mutual friend introduced him to Phil. Phil, on the other hand, was, again, like an alpha male, and it still is, an entrepreneur businessman, ran his own business, and had been doing physical challenges all through his life, very active physically. But Phil has a disabled son who was born with cerebral palsy. And at the age of 2 months, this son, Tom, was basically dying. They didn't think he was going to last the night. And Phil prayed so hard and made a bargain with God. He said, please let my son live. I promise I'll do everything my whole life to take good care of him. And he has done. And so has Tom's mother. And he's not currently married to Tom's mother, but and the other children, they've all supported Tom. Tom's an amazing human being. And at the age of 60, Phil decided that he was going to take on one physical challenge every year so that he would stay physically fit, so that he could physically lift Tom from his chair to the bed and help out with all the caregiving. And he had done quite a few different challenges throughout those years, and he was about ready to do his 5th challenge. And this is what became the 5th challenge. He ended up being mutually connected. But one of the things when they first met, they hadn't met before, was that Phil recognized that there was 2 of them. They were both strong males, but only one of them on the boat could be skipper. And I think that speaks volumes of both of them. Do you know what I mean? That he recognized that. And yes, he had humongous input into how the whole thing went along, but that somebody had to have the deciding, or the last word, if you like. And I think that was incredible. People kept asking me, what kind of fights did they have when I was writing the book, and surely they got into arguments about this, and what was the biggest drama? If you're writing a novel, you've got to create conflict, otherwise it's boring for a reader. And in a way, they kept saying, no, we just got on, because what we did was we focused on the solutions, not the problem. And we refused to there was no point in blaming, well, you did this wrong or you did that wrong, So for them to work together that tightly, people genuinely kind of don't believe it, but it is true. And this is how they went along. Now, one of the things they decided to do was create a space of time where they actually connected at the end of each day after dinner and have conversations. So they would pick a topic in the morning and discuss it, and think about it all day, and then have the discussions. And even within that, they had the same opinions on things. So they were very, very similar. There's only one night that they had a complete difference of opinion, and they were poles apart. But other than that, I mean, they had hiccups insofar as what they had to deal with. But one of them was rowing at one time. The other person was either trying to sleep or making the meals or dealing with the communications back to Talisker Whiskey Atlantic safety officer and all of that. So they didn't spend a lot of time together, ironically enough, even though there were 70 days inside this 20-foot wooden boat, you know. But yeah, so I don't think, and I think they might say the same, I don't think they really knew quite what was involved once they got on the boat and went. And yet everybody had told them the hardest part was getting to the starting line. It's not an easy challenge because you've got to raise the funds, you've got to fulfill all these physical demands, you've got to do all these prerequisites for your boat, for your training. It's a huge undertaking, you know. It took them 4 years to get to that starting line because they had lots of setbacks along the way. And unlike some of the other competitors, they did it on a shoestring. They didn't have the big commercial funding or backing or anything else like that. They literally did everything on a shoestring, which kind of led into a little bit of their issues. But I will say this, the safety officer is Ian Couch for Talisker Whiskey Atlantic Challenge. And he held their feet to the fire, so much so that like Paul hated him initially, absolutely hated him. And apparently a lot of rowers initially go, oh, you know, my life would be much better if I didn't have to fulfill all these prereqs. But Ian's doing his job, and he's doing a very fine job of keeping these people safe out there. And that's why they had to go to those stringent levels. But they had so much secondhand gear that they had literally cobbled together. I think looking back, if they were to do it again, which is highly unlikely, they would approach a couple of those things differently. But I think all of that built that experience for them, you know. And they both had, and as people will read in the book, they both had two very big emotional upheavals individually at different times, where they both had to see each other through those kind of things. So yeah, that bond is lifelong, absolutely lifelong.
And you talk about there's like stuff that happened afterwards, and although these two men are the focus of the story, reading it, especially towards the end, there seems to be a lot of focus on their families and the way they've grown as well, without getting into too much detail, because some of it happens on the boat as well. What about their growth? Because there seems to be a lot of how the families developed as well, and certain individual people within the families, how they grew as well.
Absolutely. And that is, I think, one of the key elements behind this story is how it affected the families. You know, I mean, the boys were the heroes of the physicality of the row and how they grew, but like the wives and the families are the heroines and the heroes of the story too. Interestingly enough, I had a question from a book club the other day, because when a book club chooses the book, I come and if it's in local, you know, I mean, I can visit in person or do Zoom calls with them, and I get a lot of very interesting questions back after these people have read the book. And one of the things we actually have at the back, on the back cover in the blurb, it says, "Was the decision to undertake this brave, selfish, or foolish?" And I think if you were to write a paper on the book, if you know what I mean, I think that is a very key theme to answer those questions. And I think that has a direct effect on how the experience of the husbands, the fathers going on this challenge affected those families. And like you said, I don't want to give too much away, because that's part of the journey, you know, the voyage through the pages and also their journey. And it's better not to do a spoiler alert to let people know what actually happens there. But you can see that there are consequences for the people involved around them. And so, you know, anybody new taking on a challenge like that, whether it's they're climbing the Himalayas or whatever it is, it's not just the person doing the incredible feat. It's the support system, the loved ones around them that are part of the journey. And I think, if anything, that's a lesson from this book too, how it affects other people. And I think they realize that now too as well. I know you'll see some of the dynamic changes in how they show up in the world is as a result of that.
Okay, cool. And I've got to ask you as well, how did you get Jeremy Irons to write the foreword for your book? When I first read it, I thought, gosh, that's incredible. Especially because you normally, with sports books, I know it transcends sport, but you normally get say, someone who's at least related to the sport itself. So how on earth did you manage to convince him? What's the story behind that?
Well, that's interesting too, because yes, at some point there was some suggestions. Well, you need to have a sailor be your, your forward person, or somebody who's in the big adventure sports. And I said, no, I'd like to ask Jeremy Irons. Once upon a time, I started out as an actor and a TV director in Ireland, and a theatre director. My father was an actor, and he was cast in a movie called The Mission with Robert De Niro and Jeremy Irons. And I had just finished a stint actually at the National Theatre in London, and I was between gigs. And my dad said to me at the time, he said, this movie we're making is being shot in South America. Do you want to come and like be an assistant with me and help me out and everything? And I was like, all right, let me think about that for all of 3 seconds. Yes, I'm there, I'm going. So when I got to South America, we started off that movie filming in Colombia. And it's set actually around the Iguazu Falls down in Argentina. The later part it was shot in Argentina and Brazil. And obviously I got to meet Jeremy Irons, but what the production company learned about me at the time was that I had a background in outdoor adventures and sports and canoeing and a bit of rock climbing and all that kind of stuff. So I ended up getting a job as the stunt assistant on the movie The Mission. And that was amazing. It was fantastic. So I was 4 months on the program with that. And obviously I got to spend some time with Jeremy Irons and Liam Neeson and Robert De Niro and all of those. And Jeremy Irons' son was over as well. And Sinead Cusack, his wife, is also Irish. So I got to know them through that. And as Jeremy has written in the foreword, he goes, years passed before he heard of me again. And at that stage I was on the boat. What I did was, I thought about it originally actually for my memoir. When I was getting my memoir submitted, I wrote to him again and I said, would you be interested in writing the foreword for the memoir? And he's a sailor, he's an avid, very keen sailor, which made sense. And I said, and by the way, I'm with Gary here, and we're on the boat in the Caribbean. Do you want to come sailing with us? And I got a message back, yeah, he'd love to come sailing, but he was like super busy at the time. He was doing the Gucci movie, and he was doing Munich Edge of War. He was doing an awful lot of stuff, but he took time out to read my book and said, yeah, he would do that. But I didn't end up getting that one published at the time. And then when this one came out, I said, well, how about reading this one? And he said, yep, absolutely. And he wrote the foreword. And coincidentally, he has very graciously recorded the foreword that he wrote for it for the audiobook. And interestingly, I had produced and narrated the audiobook. And I had sent it out to some people I know out in Los Angeles and said, you guys listen to audiobooks all the time. Can you give me a little bit of feedback before I, read some more chapters? And one was the foreword. And they said, no, the narration is fine. It sounds great. It's very interesting. But it's a little weird where in the foreword, where you're talking about yourself in the third person, because I was reading Jeremy's words, where it goes, I first met Niamh McAnally in Colombia in the jungle on the arm of her father. And I was like, yeah, it kind of does sound weird. So then I said, what are we going to do about that? Well, we'll have to get somebody else to read the foreword, but I think male would be good, but I don't want it to be anybody who sounds like Jeremy Irons, because then it would look like we're trying to pretend to be Jeremy Irons, right? So anyway, Gary did it with an American accent, and we thought that'd be great. And when Jeremy Irons came to the launch in Dublin to launch it with me very graciously, and we were chatting afterwards at dinner, and I was telling him this story, and he goes, why didn't you ask me to do it? And I'm like, hello, that's a big job, you know what I mean? And he said, no, sure, I'll be happy to do it for you. And he did. While we were in Ireland, he recorded it, and then we re-uploaded it. So the new audiobook has his narration on it. I cannot tell you, Chris, what a gracious human being he is. He is so involved in so many charities, and he is the real deal. Do you know what I mean? It's not like, oh, look at me with a baby and doing good in the world. No, he's the real deal. He's an amazing human being. And I'm very grateful, very blessed for his kindness in helping me with it. And then he was very sweet at the Dublin launch. He kind of goes, I read her memoir and about her life. It's quite extraordinary. And he says, I'm expecting to see this in a bound form and a beautiful color and all that kind of stuff as a result of Flares Up coming in. And so, he's been wonderful, absolutely wonderful.
Okay, good. That's good. That's good. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you about your writing and the sport. And you can just tell from the way you answer, there's a passion you've had, not just for this book, but for sailing in general. So thank you so much again for agreeing to do this interview. It's been an absolute pleasure. Just one final question. In regards to your work, you talked about your memoir. Is there a title for it? Is there any rough publication dates? When's that due to come out?
Well, at the moment, it's called Following Sunshine because it's the story of my life. And I, when I left Ireland, I was like, I don't want to live in the cold, the dark, the wind, and the rain anymore. I want to live in nice, warm places. Titles change. You know, a publisher could turn around and say that's not a very strong title. There's another title in the running, which is called Freed Spirit with a D, which was actually the name of the sailboat that we were on. So it's free with a little D on the top, Freed Spirit. So it might come out as that. Right now, we're looking for an American publisher for it. So if anybody listening knows of an American publisher who would be dying to have the book published, contact me. So that's where we're at with it at the moment. So I don't actually have a publication date. So it's in the works. And the memoir was true to my story. Flares Up is true to the Paul and Phil story. And I'm kind of thinking book 3 is going to be made up, because it'd be nice not to have to be worrying about people's real lives. I could actually like write stuff off the top of my head, but we'll see. It seems to be my natural kind of passion to put into words experiences that people that are relatable. And if there was one thing I would say about Flares Up is this: the boat was called DD for short, Dream It, Do It. And not only does the book transcend rowing, but I think what's relatable, and if there was a message I want to get out into the world to share their story, is that it doesn't matter. You may never row an ocean. You may never, paddle across the Bath. But what this book is trying to show you is whatever that goal is you've set yourself, or whatever challenge you have to overcome, there's relatability here to help you achieve your greatest life and live the best life you want to live. And what reminds me of it all the time is I put that word in my head, Dee, just dream it, do it.
Okay, cool. And just to show the cover of the book again, I would highly recommend this. And as you've just mentioned, it's not just a book about sailing, it's a book about endeavor, about overcoming any challenges and not being afraid to take new ones as well. So again, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Do you have a website or any social media that people can visit if they want to look at any past work or any future work that you're doing?
Yes, absolutely. My website is called thewriteronthewater.com.
Okay.
And you'll find all sorts of, all my interviews and television stuff and all that is in there, but also my blogs and articles and short stories and all that kind of good stuff. So there's plenty there to peruse, and galleries of where we've been, like photographs of the different places we've been to on the boat and everything. Okay,
absolutely fantastic. Anyone who's watching this on YouTube, I'll include a link to your website in the description below. If anyone enjoyed this interview, then please like it. Please subscribe to the podcast as well. It really helps. We want to make this channel grow. If you want to follow me on Twitter, it's at the 286 project. So it's at the 286 project. Again, I'll leave that in the description below. Okay. Niamh McAnally, thank you so much for doing the interview. God bless, and I'm wishing you well for the rest of your writing.
Thank you so much, Chris. Lovely to be with you.
So you take care.